Welcome to Brain Vault. This is the Great Indian Think Project. Any data and information quoted in this podcast is linked below in description, so be sure to check that out. Today, we're embarking on a deep dive into, a really pivotal moment in India's economic history, the 1991 economic reforms and their lasting impact. You sent us a stack of fascinating sources, everything from economic surveys to research papers, giving us this really multifaceted view of the transformation. And yeah, we're excited to unpack it.
What's truly compelling here, I think, is how these reforms weren't just a sudden policy shift. They didn't happen in a vacuum, right?
Right.
They were a direct, almost desperate response to a looming crisis, but they also emerged from, a complex interplay of decades of economic philosophy and accumulated challenges. Our mission today is to trace that entire journey, maybe starting from ancient prosperity all the way to near collapse, understand the specific revolutionary changes that were enacted, and then really dig into how India fundamentally shifted its trajectory. And we'll be using hard numbers and historical context to trace this monumental ongoing transformation.
So how did a nation on the brink of economic collapse not only survive, but, start to thrive? Today, we're tracing that remarkable journey. We'll begin by peeling back the layers of India's ancient economic past, understanding the foundations laid centuries ago, and then we'll zero in on the perfect storm that brewed into the infamous 1991 crisis. From that precipice, we'll dive into the monumental shift, the liberalization, privatization, and globalization, or LPG as it's known.
Right, LPG.
And how that rippled through every facet of Indian life, from its bustling markets to the daily experiences of its citizens. And finally, we'll place India's unique transformation alongside its Asian giant neighbor, China, to truly understand what sets their paths apart and what lessons they might hold.
Yeah, that comparison is always fascinating.
It's a story of resilience, bold decisions, and a nation finding its new trajectory. Okay, so before we jump right into the crisis itself, it feels essential to set the stage by looking at India's long economic history. Modern narratives sometimes overlook just how prominent India was globally. How prosperous was India, truly, before colonial rule, fundamentally altered its trajectory?
A crucial starting point, definitely.
Yeah.
Because it reveals the immense economic potential that was later suppressed and what needed to be rebuilt, essentially. In the 16th century, India wasn't just prosperous. It was arguably the world's leading economic powerhouse.
Really? Leading?
Yes. Its GDP was estimated to be an astonishing 25.1% of the entire world economy.
Wow, a quarter of the global economy.
Exactly. To truly grasp that scale, consider this. Emperor Akbar's treasury revenue in 1600 AD was a massive 17.5 million. Now compare that to Great Britain's entire treasury 2 centuries later, in 1800 AD, which totaled just 16 million pounds.
That's incredible. So Akbar's revenue alone was more than Britain's entire treasury 200 years later.
Precisely. India was a hub of manufacturing, trade, innovation, contributing a quarter of global output. This wasn't just regional dominance, it was global economic leadership.
It's hard to even fathom that level of global economic dominance for India, and yet we know that picture changed dramatically. How did the colonial era specifically dismantle that economic engine? What happened?
Well, the colonial exploitation was unfortunately brutal and systematically devastating. It wasn't just neglect, it was active dismantling. India's share of world income plummeted dramatically from 27% in 1700 AD, a time when it actually exceeded Europe's 23% share.
It exceeded Europe's share.
Yes, to a mere 3% by 1950, around the time of independence.
From 27% down to 3%. That's staggering.
It is. And this wasn't just a decline. It was a deliberate deindustrialization and exploitation of resources. India was transformed from a producer of high-value goods, think textiles, into a supplier of raw materials for British factories, and crucially, a captive market for their finished products.
So forced into a dependent role.
Exactly. This led to widespread famine, drastically low life expectancy, pervasive malnutrition, widespread illiteracy. It effectively crippled a once flourishing economy and left it profoundly impoverished by the time of independence.
So after that devastating impact of colonial rule, when India gained independence in 1947, it chose a very specific path to rebuild itself, a mixed economy model, right, with a strong focus on self-reliance. What was the thinking behind this approach, and how was it implemented?
Exactly. The leaders of independent India, most notably Jawaharlal Nehru, sought to avoid the pitfalls of both pure capitalism, which they associated strongly with colonial exploitation,
Understandable.
and pure communism.
Yeah.
They opted for a socialist-inspired mixed economy, but crucially one that still respected private property and democratic institutions. That was key. This vision directly led to the Industrial Policy Resolution of 1948, which formally established India as a mixed economy, defining the roles for both the public and private sectors.
Setting the framework.
Right. This was quickly followed by the establishment of the Planning Commission in 1950, which then kicked off the series of 5-year plans. The core idea was to achieve balanced growth and reduce poverty through systematic planning, centralized resource allocation, and a big focus on self-sufficiency, often termed import substitution.
Trying to make everything domestically.
Pretty much. The Mahalanobis model, for instance, heavily influenced this period, emphasizing the establishment of basic and capital goods industries, think steel plants, heavy machinery. These were seen as foundational for building a truly self-reliant economy and reducing dependence on imports.
And what were some of the tangible initiatives from this period? It wasn't just theory, right? There were concrete plans and significant investments.
Indeed. The first 5-year plan, launched in April 1951, laid the groundwork, focusing on developing agriculture, industry, and core infrastructure simultaneously. A major success during this era, particularly starting in 1968, was the Green Revolution.
Ah, yes, the Green Revolution. Huge impact.
Truly transformative for agriculture. It introduced high-yielding seeds, modern irrigation techniques, chemical fertilizers. Imagine, the average farmer's income shot up by an astonishing 70%.
70%. Wow.
Monumental. It transformed India from a nation dependent on food aid, which was a humiliating experience in the mid-1960s, to one that became self-sufficient in food grains. States like Punjab, Haryana, Uttar Pradesh really benefited.
The breadbasket states.
Exactly. Though it's fair to say this success also brought later questions about environmental sustainability, declining water tables, regional inequalities, challenges that became important later on.
Right, not without its complexities.
No. And alongside this, various industrial policy resolutions continued to shape the industrial landscape. IPR 1948 set the initial mixed economy framework. Then ITR 1956, often called the Economic Constitution of India, really emphasized heavy industry and the public sector, reserving a vast array of industries for state control.
So increasing state control.
Yes. IPR 1977 prioritized small-scale industries and introduced a core sector for strategic areas like defense, atomic energy, rail transport, limiting private entry there. And IPR 1980 aimed to promote economic federation and efficiency within the existing structure. Throughout this broad period, say from 1951 to 1979, the Indian economy grew at an average rate of about 3.1% a year in constant prices.
Okay.
Or approximately 1.0% per capita, often dubbed the Hindu rate of growth.
Right, I've heard that term. Relatively slow.
Relatively slow, yes. This state-led approach, especially initially, undeniable, focused on mobilizing resources towards industrialization, though perhaps social sectors like health and education sometimes received delayed or insufficient funding as a result.
But this planned economy, despite its intentions and some notable successes like the Green Revolution, clearly ran into serious trouble by the late 1980s, which leads us to the infamous 1991 crisis. What were the deep-seated issues? What led to this precipice?
This brings us to that critical inflection point. What exactly led to India being on the brink of economic collapse? The roots were deeply multifaceted, really reflecting decades of accumulated imbalances and policy rigidities. It wasn't just one thing.
Okay.
We saw significant fiscal laxity. Basically, the government was consistently spending far more than it earned, leading to ballooning deficits.
Living beyond its means, essentially.
Year after year. There was a growing reliance on external borrowing to bridge this gap, rather than structural reforms to fix the underlying issues. The financial sector was also weakening, burdened by non-performing assets and extensive government control. And then there was the heavy-handed regulation of trade and industry, often called the license Raj.
Ah, the license Raj.
It stifled competitiveness, innovation, private sector growth. It just made doing business incredibly difficult. But the immediate dramatic push over the edge was the Gulf War in late 1990-91.
Right, the external shock.
Exactly. This conflict drastically jacked up international oil prices,
Right.
massively increasing India's import bill for a crucial commodity. And simultaneously, it reduced crucial remittance inflows from Indian workers in the Gulf region. It's less money coming in, much more going out.
A double whammy.
Absolutely. And all this unfolded against a backdrop of unstable coalition politics in India at the time, making decisive action very difficult and just exacerbating the sense of crisis.
And what were the hard numbers, the concrete indicators that showed just how dire this economic distress was? How close did India truly come to a financial meltdown?
The indicators, they paint a very stark picture of an economy really verging on collapse. The government's finances were truly spiraling out of control. The gross fiscal deficit, basically the gap between government earnings and spending, ballooned from around 7.2% of GDP in the early 80s to a staggering 9.4% by 1991.
Nearly 10% of GDP is deficit. That's huge.
It's unsustainable. Imagine a nation consistently spending nearly 10% more than its income. That's a recipe for disaster. And this wasn't just the central government. The combined fiscal deficit of central and state governments also hit 9.8% in 1986-87, and after a temporary dip, jumped back to 9.3% in 1990-91.
So systemic across levels of government.
Yes, this fiscal imbalance inevitably fed into the external accounts, creating a severe balance of payments crisis. The current account deficit, the difference between money flowing in and out for trade and services, soared to 3.5% of GDP, and an alarming 43.8% of exports in 1990-91.
So nearly half of export earnings were needed just to cover the current account gap.
Effectively, yes. It meant India was importing far more than it was exporting and financing that gap, primarily with debt.
And I distinctly recall reports, even as a kid, of India's foreign exchange reserves dwindling to almost nothing. What was the critical point they reached? What did that mean?
They plummeted to below $1 billion in January 1991.
$1 billion.
Yeah.
For the whole country.
For the whole country. To give you context, that barely covered 2 weeks of essential imports, including critical items like oil.
2 weeks? That's terrifying.
It was. In 1991, foreign currency reserves were a mere $2,236 million, a sharp drop from the average of $5,022 million in the late 80s. The external debt indicators were equally dire for 1990-91. Debt-stock GDP ratio, 28.7%. Debt service ratio, how much of export earnings went to paying off debt, was 35.3%.
Over a third of export earnings just servicing debt.
Exactly. And the debt exports ratio was a staggering 491.7%. But perhaps most critically, the proportion of short-term debt to foreign currency reserves soared to a dangerous 382.3%.
What does that mean exactly? Short-term debt versus reserves?
It meant that the amount of debt due for repayment within a year was nearly 4 times the entire foreign exchange reserves India held.
So if those lenders demanded payment,
India couldn't pay. Default was imminent. It was an incredibly precarious position. The country faced severe import compression. In 1991-92, imports fell by a drastic 25% in dollar terms. As the economic survey of that year grimly noted, this threatened widespread loss of production and employment and verged on economic chaos.
Chaos. Strong words from an official document.
Very. To compound the problem, non-resident Indian NRI deposit outflows accelerated in the second quarter of 1991. Confidence just evaporated.
So people were pulling their money out.
Yes, adding further pressure on the already dwindling reserves. India was staring into the abyss of defaulting on its international obligations. It was that close.
So with the economy truly on the brink, facing this monumental crisis, Dr. Manmohan Singh, as the then finance minister,
Under Prime Minister P.V. Narasimha, yes.
Right. He introduced a truly monumental budget in 1991. This was more than just a quick fix, wasn't it? There was a complete philosophical departure.
Absolutely. It was a seminal overhaul, truly reversing decades of deeply entrenched interventionist policies. It was revolutionary for India at the time. The crisis, as dire as it was deftly converted into an unprecedented opportunity to fundamentally reform, restructure, and modernize the entire economy.
Seeing opportunity in crisis.
Precisely. The immediate aim was, of course, to resolve the balance of payments crisis and avert a default. That was paramount. But the broader, more profound aim was to lay the foundation for sustainable, long-term growth by unleashing the productive forces within the economy. The budget for 1992 immediately signaled this commitment by cutting the gross fiscal deficit by over 2% of GDP.
Straight away.
Yes, from that 9.4% down to 7.0% in that first year, a serious demonstration of commitment to fiscal discipline. This was the genesis of the Liberalization, Privatization, and Globalisation, or LPG reforms that would redefine India's economic future.
Okay, let's delve into the L of LPG, liberalization. For a country so tightly controlled by the license Raj, what specifically changed in terms of industrial and trade policy? It must have been a massive shakeup for businesses.
Oh, it was a seismic shift. Industrial deregulation was sweeping, the notorious industrial licensing system.
Which required permission for almost everything.
Everything. Setting up a factory, expanding production, changing product lines. It was virtually abolished for most industries overnight.
Wow, just like that.
Pretty much. This instantly freed up entrepreneurs.
Yeah.
Similarly, the separate permissions required for MRTP houses, large companies previously scrutinized under the Monopolies and Restrictive Trade Practices Act.
To prevent monopolies.
Right, those were also done away with. The MRTP Act itself was later replaced by the Competition Act in 2002, shifting the focus to promoting healthy competition rather than just restricting size. Critically, the number of industries reserved solely for the public sector was sharply reduced.
Opening them up to private players.
Exactly. Vast areas like power, telecom, mining, now open for private enterprise, both domestic and foreign. Businesses also gained far freer access to foreign technology, which was absolutely vital for modernization and catching up globally.
And on the trade front, because India was famously a very closed economy before this, extremely high tariffs, complex import restrictions.
Precisely. The shift here was equally dramatic, transforming India's engagement with the global economy. The transition to a market-determined exchange rate began, first with a temporary, clever mechanism called EXIM scripts.
EXIM scripts, how did they work?
Think of them as tradable import entitlements linked to export earnings. Exporters received these scripts, which they could then sell to importers. It allowed market forces to start influencing the currency's value before a full flow was implemented by March 1993. A big move away from a fixed, often overvalued exchange rate.
Clever. A gradual move.
Yes. There was also a phased reduction of India's absurdly high peak custom duties. Some were up to 300% in 1990-91.
300%.
Yes. Reducing these was crucial for cutting the heavy anti-export bias that made Indian goods uncompetitive internationally, and perhaps most impactful. Import licensing controls for capital goods, raw materials, and intermediates were virtually abolished. Quantitative restrictions, quotas on imports, were progressively removed.
So basically opening the floodgates for imports needed by industry.
In a controlled way, yes. This profound opening up significantly boosted competition and efficiency, forcing Indian industries to adapt and compete globally.
Here's where it gets really interesting for many, I think, as it changed the very landscape of business. Foreign investment. This was a huge shift from the previous closed-door policy that viewed foreign capital with, let's say, deep suspicion.
Indeed. Deep suspicion is right. For the very first time, foreign investment up to 51% equity was automatically allowed in a wide range of industries. This signaled a welcoming stance rather than the previous highly restrictive one. It was a major signal change.
Automatic approval up to 51%. That's significant.
Very. New policies were also introduced to attract foreign portfolio investment directly into Indian stock markets, allowing international funds to invest in Indian companies. This automatic approval list for foreign direct investment, FDI, expanded significantly over the next few years, reaching 48 industries by 1996-97. And by 1999-2000, a truly liberalizing negative list approach was introduced.
Negative list, meaning?
Meaning all sectors were open to automatic approval unless they were specifically on a restricted list. The default became open.
A complete reversal of the old system.
Exactly. And foreign equity limits in manufacturing were entirely eliminated. This was a monumental policy reversal that transformed India from an economic hermit, really, to a destination for global capital.
Moving to the P in LPG privatization. After decades of the state controlling vast swaths of the economy, how did the government actually begin to shed its holdings in public sector enterprises, the PSEs?
Well, the government initiated a systematic program of disinvestment, essentially selling off some of its equity in these PSEs. It wasn't envisioned as a fire sale, more a measured approach to reduce the government's financial burden and hopefully encourage private sector efficiency.
Okay, so measured disinvestment.
Right. In the very first year, 1991-92, the target was to mobilize Rs 2,500 crore through disinvestment. And remarkably, they actually exceeded that, mobilizing Rs 3,040 crore.
Exceeded the target in the first year. That's interesting. Shows some appetite, maybe?
Perhaps. This program continued over the years, demonstrating a sustained, albeit sometimes slow, commitment to reducing state control. By 2017-18, the target for disinvestment had grown substantially to Rs 1,000 crore, and the achievement was an impressive Rs 1,057 crore. It underscored the long-term nature of this policy.
So it became a regular feature of budgets?
Yes. Public sector enterprises, or CPSEs, were broadly classified into strategic critical areas like defense, atomic energy, railway transport, and non-strategic categories. The policy generally stipulated that profit-making companies wouldn't be privatized, at least initially. The focus was more on improving efficiency and reducing losses elsewhere. The intent was really to rationalize the public sector, not necessarily dismantle it entirely, especially in the early years.
And the G for globalization. How did India integrate itself into the global economy beyond just opening up to foreign investment? What were the broader steps?
Globalization was indeed a multi-pronged approach, moving beyond just attracting capital. A significant institutional step was India becoming a founding member of the World Trade Organization, WTO, in 1995.
Joining the Global Trade Club.
Exactly. This commitment involved adhering to global trade liberalization rules, including further removing quantitative restrictions and progressively reducing tariffs across various sectors. Beyond formal institutional integration, a more organic form of globalization rapidly gained traction: outsourcing.
Ah, the BPO boom.
The BPO boom, the IT services revolution. Multinational corporations quickly began taking advantage of India's large English-speaking educated talent pool for various services like accountancy, banking, and particularly IT-enabled services.
Yes, right.
This led to India rapidly earning the title of the back office of the world, and later a global IT services hub. Huge competitive advantages in skilled labor and technology. This effectively integrated India into global supply chains for services, creating massive employment opportunities and foreign exchange earnings, a key part of the post-reform story.
Definitely. Okay, so beyond trade and industry, what changed for the financial sector? It was notoriously rigid, heavily controlled by the state, often directing credit based on policy priorities rather than, say, sound economic principles.
The financial sector was absolutely crucial for these reforms to succeed. It underpins all economic activity, right?
Sure.
The major aim was to reduce the Reserve Bank of India's RBI role from a rigid, prescriptive regulator to a more flexible facilitator of the financial sector. This meant allowing financial institutions far more autonomy in decision-making based on market principles, lending based on risk and return, not just government directives.
A fundamental shift in the RBI's role.
A fundamental shift. Key measures included the legislative empowerment of the capital market regulator, SEBI, the Securities and Exchange Board of India, giving it teeth to oversee and develop the stock markets. A new state-of-the-art national stock exchange, the NSE, was established to modernize capital markets, increase transparency, move away from older regional exchanges.
Bringing in electronic trading and efficiency.
Precisely. Government control over capital issues, essentially, how companies could raise money from the public, was abolished, streamlining the process for businesses. The banking sector saw the gradual phasing in of Basel prudential norms. These are international standards for bank regulation, things like income recognition, capital adequacy, provisioning for bad loans.
Making banks healthier and more resilient.
That was the goal. Reserve requirements for banks, the CRR and SLR cash reserve ratio, and statutory liquidity ratio were gradually reduced.
Freeing up more money for lending.
Exactly, freeing up funds for lending to the private sector. And, importantly, interest rates were gradually freed from direct government control, allowing market forces to determine the cost of credit. A high-level committee, the Narasimha Committee, was also appointed to comprehensively examine the financial system's structure, organization, functions, procedures, to advise on further improvements. Signal a continuous commitment to reform.
And what about tax reforms? Because the government desperately needed to stabilize its finances and generate more revenue to tackle that huge fiscal deficit that triggered the crisis.
Tax reforms were a critical component of the fiscal policy overhaul, absolutely necessary. There was a continuous reduction in individual income taxes and a gradual reduction of the corporation tax rate.
Reducing tax rates, wouldn't that lower revenue?
Well, the economic rationale was that the excessively high tax rates that existed previously often led to widespread tax evasion. It just wasn't worth being honest for many. The belief was that more moderate rates would encourage savings, investment, and crucially, voluntary disclosure and compliance.
Broadening the tax base?
Exactly. Broaden the base, improve compliance, and ultimately improve government revenue, even with lower rates. That was the Laffer curve argument, essentially. Efforts were also made to reform indirect taxes, those levied on goods and services, like excise duties and sales tax. The aim was to facilitate a common national market for goods, removing internal barriers to trade between states.
Which were a major headache for businesses.
Huge headache. A major step in this direction, though much later, was the introduction of the Goods and Services Tax, GST, in 2016, effective from 2017-18. GST was designed to create one nation, one tax, one market, simplifying the complex indirect tax structure, aiming to reduce cascading taxes and ultimately generate more revenue while reducing evasion.
A massive reform in itself.
Absolutely. Overall, the simplification of procedures was also a key focus across the board, just making it easier for people and businesses to pay their taxes and comply.
Okay, so we've covered the sweeping reforms, liberalization, privatization, globalization, plus financial and tax changes. What was the immediate effect on India's external accounts? Did we see a quick turnaround from that precarious position, reserves for just 2 weeks of imports?
We saw a remarkable turnaround, quite swiftly actually, in the external sector. The numbers really illustrate this dramatic shift from the crisis years to the mid-1990s. Export growth, in U.S. dollar terms, which had been negative, manic 1.1% in 1991-92.
Contracting.
Yes, it zoomed up impressively to 20.2% in 1993-94 and then 18.4% in 1994-95.
That's a huge jump.
Huge jump. For comparison, the average for the pre-crisis period of 1985-90 was about 11.4%. So India was rapidly becoming more competitive globally. Import growth also recovered strongly after that sharp fall of nautical 24.5% in 1991-92, which was necessary during the crisis.
Import compression.
Right. It rebounded to 15.4% in 1992-93 and a robust 34.3% in 1994-95, reflecting renewed economic activity and investment picking up.
That's quite a recovery on both sides of trade. What about the deficits that were at the heart of the crisis, the trade and current account deficits?
The trade deficit, as a percentage of GDP, improved significantly from 3.0% in 1993-91 down to just 1.0% in 1991 and 2. Immediate relief. Though it did rise again to 2.8% by 1994-95 as imports increased alongside growth, it was manageable within the context of rising foreign exchange inflows.
Okay, manageable.
Even though dramatically, the current account deficit, CAD, as a percentage of GDP, which had been that whopping 3.1% in 1991-91, improved to a very healthy 0.3% in 1994-92.
From 3.1% to 0.3% in 1 year.
Yes, almost immediate external stability demonstrated. It remained low at 1.0% by 1994-95. And how does foreign investment respond? This was a major goal, attracting global capital with the new open policies. Foreign investment saw a truly massive surge, really validating the reforms. Total foreign investment, which was only about $279 million in 1991. Tiny. It skyrocketed to $4,807 million, nearly $5 billion in 1994-95.
Wow, more than a 17-fold increase in just 4 years?
Yes. Breaking that down, direct foreign investment FDI, which creates businesses and jobs, was a mere $103 million in 1991-92. It rose almost tenfold to $983 million by 1994-95.
Right.
Portfolio investment FIIs in stock markets, GDRs, was almost negligible, $6 million in 1991-92. It exploded to an astounding $3,824 million in 1994-95.
Huge inflow into the stock market shows confidence.
Exactly. Very strong global investor confidence in India's future. This dramatic inflow directly contributed to a substantial buildup of foreign exchange reserves. They rocketed from that critical $2,236 million in 1990-92 to a much safer and robust $20,809 million by 1994-95.
Over $20 billion. That effectively ended the immediate crisis, didn't it?
It did. The balance of payments crisis was over. The exchange rate also depreciated significantly from about 18 rupees per U.S. dollar in 1991-1 to over 31 by 1994-95.
Making exports cheaper.
Right, making Indian exports more competitive internationally, further aiding the recovery. So while the external sector boomed and stabilized, fiscal consolidation, getting government finances under control, was a bit more of a mixed bag.
Oh, not as straightforward a success story?
Well, the overall trend showed initial success, definitely, but then there was some slippage before a strong recovery later in the decade.
How exactly did that play out with the government's deficits? Did they manage to rein them in long term, or were there bumps?
The gross fiscal deficit was indeed initially reduced significantly, dropped by over 2% of GDP in 1991-92, from that perilous 9.4% in 1990-91 down to 7.0%. This was largely a direct result of the stringent central budget that year, and it was also supported by an IMF loan program that mandated fiscal discipline.
Ah, the IMF conditionality.
Right. However, this initial correction was largely negated by a very large central government fiscal slippage in 1993-94. The deficit unfortunately rose back up to 8.3% of GDP.
Back up. Why?
It's perhaps not coincidental that this rebound coincided with the end of the IMF program. It suggests some of the discipline might have been externally imposed rather than fully internalized at that point.
Interesting point.
But importantly, the lost ground was quickly recovered and further consolidated in the next 3 years. We saw the lowest consolidated fiscal deficit for the entire decade, 6.4% of GDP, recorded in 1996-97. The central government, in particular, achieved its lowest deficit in 20 years at 4.1% of GDP that year, demonstrated a renewed commitment.
Okay, so a dip, but then a strong recovery to the best levels in years.
Exactly. This fiscal discipline also led to the consolidated primary deficit. Remember, that's the deficit excluding interest payments, a better measure of current effort, reaching a low point of 1.3% of GDP in 1996-97, thanks to the center's only primary surplus in 20 years. This brief period of strong fiscal health showed what was possible.
And what about the overall economic growth and investment? Did the economy respond quickly, or did it take time for benefits to trickle down after such a severe crisis?
The economy recovered smartly, almost immediately demonstrating the positive effects of the reforms. GDP growth, which had been less than 1% in the crisis year 1991-92.
Near stagnation.
Yes. It recovered to nearly 6% in 1993-94, and then exceeded 7% in each of the next 3 years.
7% plus for 3 years straight. That's strong.
Very strong. This post-crisis quinquennium, the 5-year period, saw an acceleration of GDP growth to an impressive 6.7% average, a significant jump from the pre-crisis decadal average of 5.6%. This period also witnessed a truly significant investment boom between 1993 and 1996.
An investment boom. Fueled by what?
Well, the decline in the consolidated fiscal deficit, that 3% of GDP drop between 1990 and 91 and 1995-96, made crucial room for it. It freed up capital for the private sector that the government wasn't borrowing anymore.
Reduced crowding out.
Exactly. Aggregate domestic investment rose from a low of 22.6% of GDP in the crisis year to a healthy peak of 26.9% of GDP in 1995-96. Gross domestic savings also increased significantly, reaching a peak of 25.1% of GDP in 1995-96. Indicating greater financial stability and capacity for investment.
So people and companies were saving more.
Yes. Real fixed investment in things like factories, machinery, infrastructure grew over 40% between 1993-94 and 1995-96. Industrial investment increased by over 50%. Private investment in particular showed an astounding average growth of 16.3% per annum during 1992-96.
16% growth in private investment annually. That's massive.
Massive. Clearly indicating renewed business confidence and a powerful engine for growth now unleashed by the reforms.
That paints a picture of quite a dynamic recovery and a clear shift towards private sector-led growth. How did this translate to the performance of specific sectors, like manufacturing, which was previously stifled, and agriculture, still so vital?
In the industrial sector, manufacturing recorded an impressive average real growth of 11.3% during the period 1993-94 to 1996-97.
Double-digit manufacturing growth.
Yes. A strong rebound and a clear sign of the liberalization policies taking effect, fueled by increased investment, easier access to technology, reduced bureaucratic hurdles. However, agriculture's performance was a bit more nuanced, somewhat uneven. It averaged 3.2% growth in the 9 years immediately after the 1992 crisis. That was slightly slower than the 3.6% achieved in the 1980s.
Okay, a slight slowdown overall in the 90s compared to the 80s for agriculture.
Overall, yes. But within that period, 1992-97 saw agriculture actually boom at 4.7% per year, showing its potential. But then the subsequent 4 years, from 1997-2001, recorded a dismal average of only 1.2% growth.
A boom followed by a slump. Why the volatility?
Various factors, weather, global prices, maybe lagging reforms in the agricultural sector itself compared to industry. This meant that food grain growth dropped below population growth during that slump, which is a significant concern for food security. And non-food crop growth halved to 1.9% in the 90s from 3.8% in the 80s.
So a mixed picture for agriculture.
Very much so. It highlights that while reforms spurred industry and services, the agricultural sector, still employing a large portion of the population, continued to face structural challenges and vulnerability.
Okay, let's move beyond the immediate turnaround in the 90s and look at some deeper trends and challenges that emerged later.
We've seen the impressive numbers of economic growth and investment in the immediate aftermath. But the crucial question for you, the listener, is, did this rapid economic growth, with all its impressive figures, actually translate into broad-based job creation for everyone across the country?
That's a profoundly important point, and it's been a subject of intense debate and concern for decades now, hasn't it? The employment performance post-reforms.
It really has. And the overall trend, somewhat surprisingly perhaps for a rapidly growing economy, has been a deceleration in the rate of employment growth. In fact, aggregate employment growth was almost zero, specifically a mere 0.02% during the period of 2005-10.
0.02%. Practically stagnant job growth during a high GDP growth period.
Exactly. This indicates that the employment content of economic growth, meaning how many jobs are created for each percentage point of GDP growth, the employment elasticity has sharply declined. This phenomenon is often termed jobless growth. The economy expands, but without proportionally increasing employment. Significant societal implications, obviously.
Hugely significant, especially in a country with a large young population entering the workforce. Were there particular sectors that fared better or worse, creating these surprising trends?
Yes, there were notable sectoral shifts. The fastest employment growth actually occurred in the secondary sector, manufacturing and construction. It averaged about 3.5% annually over the entire period from 1993-94 to 2009-10.
Okay, so industry did create jobs.
It did. Even during that 2005-10 period when overall growth was nearly stagnant, the secondary sector still grew at a respectable 3.5% per annum, showed some resilience. Agriculture, as expected, didn't see significant increases. In recent years, it's actually seen a decline in absolute employment, with people moving away from farming.
Right, the structural shift away from agriculture.
Exactly. The services sector, despite being the main engine of overall GDP growth, averaged about 3% per annum employment growth over the post-reform period. But its employment elasticity, its ability to generate jobs per unit of output, sharply declined, particularly after 2004-05.
So the services boom became less job-intensive over time.
Increasingly so. More capital-intensive, perhaps more focused on higher skills rather than mass labor absorption.
And were these employment trends different between rural and urban areas, given the massive internal migration we often hear about?
Absolutely a stark contrast there. Rural employment, where most people still lived, grew at 1.4% during 1993-94 to 2004-05, but then it actually declined during 2004-05 to 2009-10.
Declined. Fewer jobs in rural areas overall.
In absolute terms, yes, during that specific period. A very significant shift puts immense pressure on rural livelihoods. In contrast, urban employment growth was consistently higher, reaching 1.8% per annum during 2005-10.
Okay, so jobs are being created, but mostly in cities.
Right. This disparity highlights the increasing urbanization and the concentration of new job opportunities, especially skilled ones, in cities and towns. And it explains the mass migration from villages seeking work.
So if overall employment growth was slowing, especially rurally, what happened to unemployment rates and the overall labor force participation? Did people just stop looking for work?
It's a bit complex. Interestingly, despite the slower overall employment growth, the reported unemployment rate actually declined by 6.3 million in absolute terms between 2004-05 and 2009-10.
Unemployment went down even with slow job growth. How?
Well, this is partially explained by a notable decline in the labor force participation rate, the LFPR. LFPR measures the proportion of the working-age population who are either employed or actively looking for work.
Okay.
The overall LFPR dropped from 42.85% in 2004-05 to 39.80% in 2009-10. Fewer people were counted as being in the labor force.
And why was that?
The decline was even more pronounced for women. Female LFPR dropped from 28.86% to 22.87% in the same period, a major concern for gender equality. But this overall decline in LFPR, particularly for the younger 15-24 age group, is mainly attributed to increased enrollment in education.
Ah, so more young people were staying in school or going to college instead of looking for work.
Exactly. For the 15-24 age group, total LFPR fell from nearly 50% in 2004-05 down to about 39% in 2009-10. And this coincided with education enrollment for that same age group jumping significantly, from about 29.5% to 40% in the same period.
Okay, that's a very important nuance. A drop in LFPR due to education is arguably a positive long-term trend for human capital.
It is. It suggests investment in future productivity, though it does mask the challenge of insufficient job creation for those not in education and actively seeking work.
Right. But what about the quality of jobs that were being created? Were they better jobs, even if fewer overall?
On the quality front, there were some positive signs, yes. Organized sector employment jobs with generally better wages, benefits, security showed an increase for the first time since 1997. It grew at a reasonably high rate of 7.24% per annum during 2004-05, 2009-10.
Much faster than the overall rate.
Much faster than the 0.95% per annum growth in the unorganized or informal sector during the same period. This suggests a gradual shift towards more formal, productive employment. Furthermore, real wages adjusted for inflation of workers in all sectors and categories increased.
So purchasing power improved for those employed.
Yes, indicating an improvement in purchasing power and living standards for those with jobs, particularly in the organized sector. So while job creation faced challenges, the quality of some jobs did see improvement.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit. One of the most celebrated, most talked about outcomes of these reforms is the emergence and astonishing growth of India's middle class. How significant is this demographic shift, really, and what specific factors fueled its expansion?
What's truly fascinating here is the sheer scale and the profound implications of this shift. The Indian middle class is now estimated to comprise more than 300 million people.
300 million.
Minimum. Some estimates even suggest a figure as high as 500 million. That's a consumer base larger than the entire population of the United States.
That's huge. What drove this massive expansion?
It was driven by a powerful confluence of factors. Significantly increased employment opportunities, especially in new sectors like IT and services. This led to higher disposable incomes for many, and greater exposure to global consumerism through media, travel, the internet.
Aspirations grew.
Absolutely. The burgeoning IT sector, business process outsourcing, BPO, and the rise of private entrepreneurship provided unprecedented upward mobility for millions. For instance, back in 1994, the IT sector contributed a modest 1.2% to GDP. But it quickly became a massive employer, creating high-paying jobs.
Right, the IT boom was central.
The total labor force in India was 381 million in 1994, and it rose by 104 million by the end of 2012, averaging a 5.5 million increase per year. Consistent absorption, even if sometimes slow. And the employment elasticity of output jobs per unit of growth actually shot up dramatically across sectors between 1994 and 2012.
Oh, it improved later.
Yes, in that specific period. In manufacturing, it went from 0.27 to 1.35. Non-manufacturing, 0.74 to 1.07. Services, 0.35 to 0.55.
So growth was becoming more job-creating for a while then.
During that stretch, yes, it meant for every unit of economic growth, more jobs were being created in these sectors, directly fueling that middle-class expansion.
That kind of explosive growth and opportunities must have had profound impacts on migration, both within India and maybe internationally, and on social structures too.
Indeed. The availability of global pay scales and arguably a better work-life balance in India's globally competitive IT sector significantly impacted international migration trends. In 1990, about 0.86% of the population left India for employment abroad. That number dropped sharply to 0.4% by the end of 2014.
So less brain drain, more opportunities at home.
It suggests that yes, as more high-quality opportunities opened up domestically. However, rapid urbanization within India, fueled by massive migration from rural areas seeking these new opportunities, that brought its own set of challenges.
Like what?
Increased slum populations, informal settlements due to inadequate housing for migrants, considerable strain on already stretched urban infrastructure, transport, healthcare, sanitation, water.
The cities couldn't always cope with the influx.
Exactly. There was also a notable shift in traditional lifestyles and social structures. Joint family systems weakened as nuclear families became more prevalent, a consequence of mobility and economic independence.
Social changes alongside economic ones?
Definitely. And all these factors contributed to significant increases in monthly per capita expenditure, reflecting improved living standards for many. For combined rural-urban categories, monthly per capita expenditure rose by a remarkable 876% between 1987-88 and 2011-12, a clear indicator of growing prosperity, at least on average.
Right. But while we saw this growth, especially in services and the middle class, you mentioned infrastructure earlier.
Yes, while India saw incredible economic growth, inadequate infrastructure remained a significant and persistent bottleneck, hindering the realization of its full potential. This was a challenge pre-reforms, and it continued to be so.
That's a classic challenge for developing economies, isn't it? What were the specific areas of weakness, and how did they fare post-reforms, especially with the increased demand from a growing economy?
Historically, and continuing well into the post-reform era, key areas like banking and insurance access, transport networks, roads, railways, ports, reliable communications, and especially power supply were severely lacking. These deficiencies acted as a significant drag on overall performance, increasing costs for businesses, impacting quality of life.
So holding back growth.
Definitely. However, there were diverging paths of progress within infrastructure. The telecom sector, for instance, emerged as a truly promising success story.
Ah, yes, the mobile phone revolution.
Oh, exactly. After bold reforms to its regulatory and investment framework, it saw substantial new investments, massive productivity gains driven by new technology, and fierce competition. This led to widespread benefits from better teleconnectivity, not just for IT, but for communication and commerce across the country. Transformed access for millions.
But the power sector, which is so fundamental for industry and modernization, seems to have been a persistent problem child. What were the specific issues there, and what were the human consequences of attempts to reform it?
It absolutely was, and it continues to be one of India's most critical infrastructure challenges even today. The power sector struggled with grossly inefficient state electricity boards, SEBs, a long history of massive underpricing for agricultural users, often for political reasons.
Free power for farmers, that kind of thing.
Yes, or highly subsidized. Very high levels of power theft were also rampant. Complex cross-subsidies hurt industries, making their operations more expensive to subsidize others. This mess led to declining investment in generation and transmission, resulting in chronic power shortages, widespread brownouts, frequent blackouts, a major constraint.
So attempts were made to reform this.
Yes, but attempts at power sector reforms in many states, which often involved removing subsidized rates and imposing steep tariff hikes to make SEBs financially viable. They often had severe social consequences for vulnerable populations. A stark and tragic example is the Siricilla tragedy in Andhra Pradesh in the late 1990s.
What happened there?
Thousands of power loom workers faced a livelihood crisis. Their wages were linked to cloth production, and they were already suffering. Then tariff hikes hit their small businesses hard. It led to desperation, and tragically, over 50 reported suicides.
Oh, that's terrible.
It highlights the complex social ramifications, the human cost, of purely economic reforms implemented without adequate safety nets, without efficient, compassionate implementation, especially when essential services become unaffordable. A very difficult balance.
Indeed. What about social sectors like healthcare? How did economic reforms and subsequent growth impact health outcomes, given India's historical underinvestment in this area?
This raises that important question of public spending priorities and human development again. India has historically spent very little on health, consistently around 1.2% of its GDP.
1.2%, that's incredibly low.
Among the lowest in the world, far below what's needed. However, in more recent years, particularly around 2012-13, there were significant proposed changes and initiatives signaling a shift. The 12th Five-Year Plan, 2012-17, proposed a substantial increase in healthcare spending, finally recognizing the dire need. And crucially, for the very first time, a basic framework for universal health coverage, UHC, was proposed, aiming to ensure access to essential health care for all citizens, moving away from a system heavily reliant on out-of-pocket payments that burdened the poor.
A move towards UHC, that's a major policy shift. What specific legislative or institutional initiatives supported this?
Several key initiatives were introduced around that time. The Clinical Establishment Act 2010, notified in 2012, was significant. It mandated standard infrastructure and clinical practices for healthcare facilities nationwide.
Trying to ensure a baseline quality.
Yes, moving away from unregulated practices. The Indian Public Health Standards, IPHS 2012, revised guidelines for public health centers, building on earlier versions, aiming to improve service delivery, incorporating lessons from programs like the National Rural Health Mission. In medical education, recognizing the shortage of doctors, 26 new medical colleges were supported under the Pradhan Mantri Swasthya Suraksha Yojana, PMSSY, and it was proposed to upgrade nearly 90% of all existing government medical institutions during the 12th Five-Year Plan.
Ambitious plans for expansion.
Very. The long-term goal, reported back in 2012, was to eventually have a medical college in each of the 626 districts of India, drastically increasing the supply of doctors.
That sounds like a big push on the human capital side of health. But were there persistent challenges despite these efforts? In implementation or quality, perhaps?
Absolutely. Significant challenges remain despite the policy intent. There was, and continues to be, a persistent shortage of medical specialists. For instance, as of 2012, 60% of specialist posts were still vacant in community health centers across the country, a figure expected to remain high.
60% vacancy, that's huge.
Crippling in many areas. There were also concerns about the effectiveness of compulsory rural service for medical graduates. Many felt unprepared or unwilling to serve in remote locations, led to calls for better training and incentives. Experts also highlighted the need for better integration of family medicine into the MBBS curriculum to create more generalist physicians for primary healthcare needs.
More focus on primary care.
Yes. And in terms of ethical practices, the Uniform Code of Pharmaceutical Marketing Practices, UCPMP, was introduced in 2011, but notably, it was voluntary.
Voluntary?
Yes, unlike the mandatory code for medical professionals. This raised questions about its effectiveness in curbing unethical marketing by pharma companies. So while policies moved in the right direction, effective implementation and addressing structural issues remain critical. Still a work in progress.
Right. And coming back to the fiscal front, you mentioned earlier there was a strong consolidation up to 1996-97.
Right.
What happened after that? Did the discipline hold?
Unfortunately, Post-1109697, after that period of strong consolidation, we saw some reversals on the fiscal front. It undermined some of the earlier gains, indicating that fiscal discipline was a continuous struggle, not a one-off fix.
So despite the initial success, fiscal challenges reemerged. How significant was this deterioration? What drove it?
Yes, the consolidated fiscal and revenue deficits steadily deteriorated after 1996-97. The government was again spending significantly more than it earned, and more revenue was going to non-productive uses. Between 1995-96 and 1999-2000, both the fiscal deficit and the revenue deficit increased by about 3% of GDP.
Another 3% of GDP added to the deficits. That's substantial, wiped out the earlier gains.
Pretty much. About half of this worsening was attributed to the phasing in of increases in government pay scales following the recommendations of the Fifth Pay Commission.
Ah, the Pay Commission awards. Big impact on government spending.
Huge impact. This sharp widening of deficits was directly reflected in a decline in public savings. It fell from a positive 2% of GDP in 1995-96 to a negative 1% in 1998-99.
Negative public savings, meaning the government was borrowing just to cover consumption?
Exactly. Not only consuming all its revenue, but also borrowing to meet consumption expenditure. This reduces funds available for public investment.
And what was the impact on India's debt burden? That was a major trigger for the 1991 crisis. Did debt start piling up again, alarmingly?
The rising deficits directly contributed to an increase in public debt, though thankfully not back to the crisis levels of 1991. The ratio of the combined debt of the center and states to GDP increased by 13 percentage points, from 56.5% in March 1997 to a substantial 69.7% by March 2002.
Back up to nearly 70% of GDP. That's a significant reaccumulation of debt.
It is, increasing the burden on the future. Now, while some central public sector enterprises, CPSEs, showed improved performance during this later period, their net profit increased massively by 599% from 1997-98 to 2006-07, and the number of loss-making CPSEs reduced from 100 to 59.
So some positive effects from reforms and greater autonomy there.
Yes, indicating some positive effects. But challenges in the broader public sector persisted. Calls for modernization and restructuring of SIC units continued. The Sick Industrial Companies Act, SICA, was extended to public enterprises in 1993 to address chronic losses and facilitate turnaround or closure. It showed a continued struggle to reform the large, often inefficient public sector.
Okay, let's broaden the lens now. When we talk about rapid economic transformation in Asia, China inevitably comes up as the benchmark, the ultimate success story for many. How does India's growth trajectory, particularly post-1991, compare to China's remarkable path? Are they converging, diverging? What are the key differences?
If we connect this to the bigger picture of global economic development, it's undeniable that both countries have undergone unprecedented economic transformation in recent decades, truly historic. However, their growth models have been fundamentally different, leading to quite distinct outcomes. China, for instance, focused intensely on a manufacturing export-led model, attracting massive foreign direct investment, FDI, into factories, export-oriented industries. This led to what's sometimes called the China shock to the global economy due to its overwhelming manufacturing output.
The workshop of the world.
Exactly. India, on the other hand, based its post-reform growth primarily on the expansion of its services sector, particularly IT and IT-enabled services.
A services-led model versus manufacturing-led?
Broadly, yes. This divergence is also visible in the overall scale and speed. China's GDP increased an astonishing tenfold in 40 years, lifted hundreds of millions out of poverty, transformed its global standing. India's increased fivefold during a similar period. A remarkable achievement in itself, absolutely, but at a different pace and with a different structural composition.
That's a stark difference, tenfold versus fivefold. And what about investment levels and the share of manufacturing in their economies? China, the factory of the world, while India often struggles to boost manufacturing.
Indeed. The difference in investment levels and manufacturing focus is significant. India's aggregate investment share of GDP, crucial for long-term growth and jobs, has been around 30% in recent years. Notably, it was over 30% for roughly the period 2005-13, a period of accelerated growth for India.
Okay, 30% or so.
China, famously the investment champion, has consistently kept its investment share of GDP over 30% since 1992. And remarkably, it has been over 40% for the past 15 years.
Over 40% of GDP invested. Consistently.
Consistently, pushing an enormous amount of capital into building infrastructure and industrial capacity. A World Bank report even endorsed pushing India's investment share towards 40% by 2035 to accelerate its development, aiming to match China's initial growth rates.
And for manufacturing specifically, what were India's stated ambitions compared to China's approach?
India has historically set explicit and ambitious quantitative targets for manufacturing. Its National Manufacturing Policy, NMP 2011, aimed to enhance manufacturing's share in GDP to 25% and add 100 million jobs by 2025, recognizing its job-creating potential.
25% share and 100 million jobs. Very ambitious.
Very. The highly publicized Make in India initiative, launched in 2014, also called for a 25% share by 2022, a target that ultimately wasn't met, highlighting the difficulty of this structural transformation. NITI Aayog, India's policy think tank, now talks about a 25% target for 2047, the centenary of independence, still aiming for that goal.
So the target remains, but the timeline keeps shifting.
Seems so. For context, manufacturing, the secondary sector, was 13% of India's GDP in 1950-51 and rose to about 24.9% by 2011-12. Some growth, but short of the desired leap. Meanwhile, services, tertiary sector, grew dramatically from 28% to 59% in the same period, becoming the dominant sector by far.
And China's approach to manufacturing targets?
Interestingly, China has never set a quantitative target for manufacturing's share of GDP. Their policy discussions focus more on qualitative goals, maintaining basic stability, moving up the value chain, innovation, a different, perhaps more organic approach to industrial policy.
Fascinating difference. Okay, this next area is crucial, often highlighted in development studies. Human capital and state capacity. What about the quality of the workforce and the delivery of basic public services in India compared to China? This must have a huge impact long term.
What's fascinating here again is the contrasting approaches. After independence, India invested more heavily in university education, created world-class institutions like the IITs, which is commendable, but perhaps inadvertently it neglected broad-based primary and secondary education for the masses, resulted in a relatively small cohort of highly skilled graduates amidst a large population with lower levels of basic education.
A top-heavy system, in a way.
You can say that. China, by contrast, initially focused intensely on achieving broad-based basic education and universal literacy before significantly expanding university education after the 1980s. This created a much larger, more uniformly educated workforce at the base.
Different sequencing of educational investment. And what are the results today in literacy and education attainment?
India has certainly made significant strides since the 1990s to expand enrollment in primary and secondary education. That's reflected in rising literacy rates. India's adult literacy rate rose impressively from around 50% in the 1990s to over 75% today, almost 100% literacy among young people now.
That's significant progress.
It is. The completion rate for lower secondary education has reached almost 90% among the relevant age group, compared to maybe 60% in the early 2000s.
Right.
Notable achievements, however. The quality of basic public education still seems to be a major challenge. Alarming reports of teacher absenteeism, poor teaching methods, inadequate infrastructure persist.
So enrollment is up, but quality lags.
That seems to be the consensus. This points to a fundamental issue of state capacity. The government's ability to deliver high-quality basic public services effectively across the board. Higher-income Indians generally avoid public education and healthcare systems due to this perceived poor quality, opting for private alternatives, which of course exacerbates inequality in access to good services.
Right, the two-tier system emerges.
This brings us squarely to state capacity, which is a major point of divergence and arguably a key difference in development outcomes between India and China. India's government seems to struggle considerably to deliver basic public services and provide a baseline level of human welfare across its vast population. In stark contrast, arguably, to China's more robust and effective state apparatus in delivering basics.
That's a very significant claim, especially for a country of India's size and ambition. Can you give us a concrete, compelling example of this struggle in delivering basic welfare?
One alarmingly high statistic that really underscores this point is the proportion of underweight and stunted children in India. The last comprehensive survey data from 2020 indicated that a staggering 36% of young children in India were stunted.
36%. Over a third of young children stunted.
Yes, far too short for their age. A clear indicator of chronic malnutrition and poor health in early life with long-term consequences. To put this in perspective, this proportion is similar to what China experienced back in the mid-1980s, a time when China's per capita GDP was only about a third of India's today.
So India today has stunting levels similar to China decades ago, despite being much richer per capita now.
Exactly. It highlights a persistent challenge in translating aggregate economic growth into fundamental human development outcomes and equitable access to basics like nutrition, sanitation, healthcare. Even in relatively developed states like Karnataka, home to Bangalore's IT hub, the proportion of stunted, underweight children or those not enrolled in school remains higher than in some poorer states.
Even in the richer states.
Yes, suggesting that the significant increase in economic resources available to state governments hasn't always translated effectively into better outcomes for much of the population. It reflects systemic issues in governance and last-mile delivery.
So considering all these comparisons of the services-led growth, manufacturing challenges, human capital issues, state capacity struggles, is India simply destined for a different, perhaps slower path than China? Or is there a unique trajectory emerging that plays to its specific strengths?
That's the critical question for India's future, isn't it? The services boom in India is undoubtedly strong enough to power 7% plus aggregate growth, despite the persistent challenges in agriculture and manufacturing. That's significant in itself. It's hugely important that India now has something of a self-reinforcing growth cycle in foreign and private sector investment and exports.
A virtuous cycle.
Potentially. It's reminiscent of what happened in China in the 2000s, after its WTO entry, attracting massive FDI, export engine taking off. Even if India's cycle is mostly in services, which might have fewer direct spillovers to mass employment than manufacturing, it's still a powerful engine.
So,
Build on the strengths. That's one influential school of thought. Instead of trying to be like China in terms of macro aggregates like manufacturing share or state control, India should strategically focus on building on what is already working. This means not just facilitating the tech boom, but also making more sectors outside IT services attractive to investment, domestic and foreign, through consistent policy, ease of doing business, and crucially, trying to steadily improve state capacity and the delivery of those basic public services, fundamental for human development and broad-based prosperity. India is clearly forging its own unique path, driven by its specific democratic and economic strengths and navigating its inherent challenges. It's not a China clone, nor should it try to be.
okay, so bringing this all together, what does it all mean? We've traced India's incredible journey from the very brink of economic crisis in 1991 to becoming one of the fastest-growing major economies in the world today. It's truly been a story of bold, transformative reforms, yes, but also persistent challenges and the emergence of this truly unique development path.
Indeed. The economic reforms of 1991 were nothing short of a masterstroke, given the circumstances. They fundamentally transformed India's economic destiny. We've seen substantial gains across the board. Foreign trade reached a massive U.S. $785 billion back in 2012, showcasing India's deep integration into the global economy. India became a leading country in services sector, rightfully earning that title back office of the world thanks to its IT prowess. And significant progress has been made in manufacturing in certain niches. India's become a hub for small cars, engineering goods, pharmaceuticals. Today, India is currently a U.S. $4.5 trillion economy on a purchasing power parity PPP basis. Adjusting for cost of living, it's huge, demonstrates the sheer scale and growth of its economic ascent. This transformation has profound global implications.
The emergence of that large, aspirational middle class, the boom in IT and services, the increased global integration, these are undeniable successes. They've reshaped the social fabric, created new opportunities, altered consumption. But our deep dive also showed us the persisting, deep-seated challenges in agricultural productivity, critical infrastructure gaps, the quality and quantity of employment, and that foundational issue of state capacity in delivering equitable basic services.
This raises an important final question, perhaps, for you, the listener. What stands out most from this complex and dynamic transformation? India's experience since 1991 demonstrates powerfully that economic transformation isn't a single linear process. It's not a simple recipe. It's a dynamic interplay of courageous, sometimes painful, policy decisions, powerful global forces, and complex internal societal shifts. The journey highlights the remarkable resilience and adaptability required for large-scale economic development. It emphasizes that even with impressive growth numbers, fundamental reforms and addressing deep-seated inequalities remain ongoing, critical tasks for India. The very fact that India could rebound from a crisis of that magnitude and chart its own distinct growth trajectory, well, it offers powerful lessons in economic policy, national determination, and that intricate balance between growth and equitable development.
A fascinating and ongoing story. That's all for today's deep dive into India's economic reforms.
Thank you for listening to this podcast. You were listening to the Great Indian Think Project on the Brain Vault.